Casual Roundhouse is back in your life for another edition. I'm the host, Michael Trochet. Thank you, everybody that clicked on the video and is now watching. There's been a lot since the last edition I posted, and that's just because if I look at my handy-dandy notebook, there was no UFC card this past week, but there was a relatively big boxing fight between Charlo and Canelo Alvarez, and I was looking forward to this fight initially. And if you watched Charlo versus Brian Castano, you would have been excited for this matchup as well. But the version of Charlo that was in there against Canelo compared to the version of Charlo that was in there against Castano, it was like night and day difference to me. And it made for a relatively one-sided fight in which Canelo won by decision. So with that being said, I just wanted to give a brief recap of what the combat sports world brought this past weekend, because now we're going to go back 2 weeks to UFC Fight Night Fiziev versus Gamrot, which was an odd night at the UFC Apex. There was a couple of key points I really just wanted to touch on in recap of this event. First one being the fight between Cody Brundage and Jacob Malkoun. It was stopped and Malkoun was disqualified due to a illegal strike to the back of the head that Brundage wasn't able to continue from. I just want to ask anybody that watches this, do you think that that fight should be rebooked or that the UFC should look into that at all? Because up until the point where that illegal strike landed, Malkoun was dominating that first round, and it was going to be a 10-8 round, and there was a possibility that he could get a stoppage before the third round ended. But regardless, it's in the past, and there has been no development on that situation. So I digress. Next key point that I want to talk about is the fight of the night from that card, which was Tim Means versus Andre Fialho. And I just want to acknowledge that at 39 years old, Tim Means looked refreshed and motivated and a lot healthier in that fight than in his previous fights. I was at the UFC Charlotte card where he fought Alex Morono, and that was a good fight as well, but he had a different type of spirit to him. It was a refuse to lose type of will that he brought against Fialho, and Fialho deserves his flowers too, because that man is always in an absolute firefight, and it played to his detriment in this case because he was willing to exchange strikes with Tim Means, and he got caught a couple too many times. And I have so much respect for Fialho. Ever since his fight with Michel Pereira, I've admired his spirit. But as a mixed martial artist, you gotta expand your game so that you can avoid taking such damage in all of your fights. Because we know you're tough. We know you got heart. Now you gotta start submitting guys and stuff so that you can avoid taking damage. Regardless, it was impressive to see Tim Means fight the way he did, and Andre Fialho. That was really the only point I wanted to make. And then there were a couple of finishes on this card also that really were those types of wins that can elevate the career trajectory of a fighter. First, Charles Jourdain, an impressive submission victory over Ricardo Ramos. Same thing with Brian Battle, another finish against AJ Fletcher, second round submission, and then Marina Rodriguez just putting on a striking clinic in her rematch against Michelle Waterson-Gomez, where it seemed like Waterson-Gomez was just outmatched from the start, but she was just too tough to quit, and I respect that. But those are the types of fights where the winner is elevated in victory. And next point has to do with the co-main event between Dan Ige and Bryce Mitchell. I don't understand how the scorecards were what they were when damage is the number one scoring criteria for mixed martial arts, because it appeared to me that Dan Ige dished out more damage inflicted more damage than Bryce Mitchell did. And Bryce Mitchell simply neutralized the damage that Ige was inflicting by controlling him. Control time leading to neutralization of damage is more prioritized to these judges based off their scorecards than damage inflicted in general. I'm not a judge. I don't work for an athletic commission. I feel like I could, but it's that fight. Like, obviously, I'm not saying Bryce didn't deserve the win, but the way that the fight was scored told a different story than the fight itself. And then the finish to the main event, obviously, when you have an injury TKO like that, it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. In the case of Fiziev, he's the one suffering the injury, and he looked great. His takedown defense looked insane. Gamrot was trying to treetop him, and Fiziev's leg was above his own head, and he's hopping around on one leg, still stuffing these takedown attempts. It's incredibly athletic, incredibly impressive. And on the feet, it was a chess match. Despite Gamrot not able to take the fight to the ground and have significant control time on Fiziev, he held his own on the feet up until the point of the injury. But a win like that does not really validate Gamrot elevating into title contention. I think, and this is just hypothetically speaking, the UFC should look to match Gamrot up against Dan Hooker next. Think about it. Gamrot fought Jalen Turner this past March at UFC 285. It was a close fight, and he came out on the winning side of the decision. Dan Hooker also just fought Jalen Turner in a war at UFC 290 and came out on the winning side of a decision. Thing is, I was at UFC 285, and when I heard Bruce Buffer say 30-27 Gamrot, I kind of freaked out a little bit, just because I was like, how? Turner had to have at least won one of those rounds against Gamrot. But like I said, that makes the most sense in terms of if Gamrot wants to get that win that will really elevate him into title contention, because the win that Hooker got over Jalen Turner is a lot more impressive than the win Gamrot got over Jalen Turner, in my opinion, at least. And then that's UFC Fight Night, Gamrot versus Fiziev. Now I'm going to quickly just talk about Dana White's Contender Series, specifically the last 2 weeks, because on not this past episode, but last week's episode, we had 2 fighters who ended up still receiving their winning pay and receiving a UFC contract despite losing their fight. And that was simply because of the amount of skill, toughness, heart, and desire that they showed in their fight. And it was one man and one woman, Angel Pacheco and Carly Giudice. And I was sitting there just in awe of what I was watching, because they looked like they belonged. And I was thinking to myself as those fights were progressing, like, both of these fighters in both of those fights deserved UFC contracts. And the fact that it came to fruition was like, it was nice to see, because a lot of times you get that life isn't fair factor, and that wasn't the case on this episode. But then again, on this week's episode, we had Jose Medina just show otherworldly resilience against Gadji Yasulov and still get a contract just based off being resilient when he didn't show any world-class technique. Granted, he was landing shots against Gadji Yasulov and making it very difficult to be taken out. But I'm just curious to see how a fight like that between these two gentlemen ages once they get that experience in the UFC. Anyways, now we transition to this weekend's UFC card, headlined by another lightweight matchup between Grant Dawson and Bobby Green. It's not the most eye-catching matchup, because obviously both Bobby Green and Grant Dawson are not, they're not top 5 guys, and they're not, out here making headlines and trying to be the most popular UFC fighter. They're just 2 really good fighters who deserve this spot. In the case of Grant Dawson, he's very underrated, and if you follow his social media, he's very, very keen on the idea of fight IQ and just being very mindful of every move you make as a professional fighter, and I respect that because he's showing what he's doing to be successful. In the case of Bobby Green, he's one of those guys he's been around forever, and he has slowly but surely accumulated a very impressive resume. Like, you know what you're getting when you face Bobby Green because he's a sprawl and brawl type of fighter. But before we get too deep into that main event, I do want to talk about a couple of other matchups on that card and get my handy dandy notebook out, because first thing is we got Joaquin Buckley making his second appearance, I believe, at welterweight, and he's facing Alex Morono, and both guys are coming off of finishes. But in the case of Buckley, he finished Andre Fialho in his debut at welterweight, and Alex Morono got a submission over Tim Means in Charlotte in May. I'm not sure who to favor in this fight. I would favor Buckley because he's the more explosive fighter, going down a weight class and already being in really good shape at 185. And it's just going to be on Morono to be resilient and find his openings. And if he can work it to the ground, it will favor him much more. I would favor Buckley on the feet, but if it goes to the ground and Buckley can't find his way back up, I would favor Morono. What else we got on the handy dandy notebook? We got Joe Pyfer back again after dropping a gem of a quote in his media appearance. He's taking on a legitimately dangerous opponent in Abdul Razak Alhassan. And Alhassan has already experienced tough losses and tough fights in the UFC and has shown that he can still be dangerous through adversity. Joe Pyfer has been clean thus far in the UFC. Clean knockouts, minimal damage taken, and obviously showing incredible threats and danger of his own. But I think that this has the potential to be a very good fight, and we could potentially see just how tough Joe Pyfer is in this fight. I could be wrong, and he could continue his vindictive finish streak. I'm not putting that past him at all. I'm just saying he's fighting somebody who presents some significant threats in Alhassan. Drew Dober is back. He's always fun to watch. He's taking on Ricky Glenn. That's a relatively winnable fight for him, in my opinion. I know he fought Matt Frivola and got caught and got chinned, and everybody knows that Drew Dober is considered the Crimson Chin of the UFC. But I would still favor Dober against Ricky Glenn. He's going to be looking to bounce back emphatically after getting finished. Simple as that. Most guys at the highest level of MMA, when they get finished or they lose in a fashion, any kind of fashion really, they bounce back more oftentimes than not when they've been exposed to that next level already. I also want to highlight Alexander Hernandez and Bill Algeo. These guys are both tough, durable, and fun to watch. I think this has chances of being fight of the night. And if not this fight, I feel like Pyfer and Alhassan could also be fight of the night. But I'm not really going to go too deep into detail about like who I think is going to win and this, that, and the third, because honestly, I'm just looking forward to watching the fights play out. That's part of being a fan with this sport. And there's a lot of fighters on this card who are going to be looking to work their way back up. And I feel like it's going to bring a lot of hard-nosed battles. I could be wrong. I don't know. All I'm saying is this has potential to be a very underrated card. Let me know what you guys think about this weekend's card and everything going on in the combat sports world, whether it has to do with this fight night card, Gamrot vs. Fiziev card, Dana White's Contender Series, boxing. It could be anything. I love chatting combat sports, and I love interacting with people. So I appreciate you sticking it out this long with me for another edition of Casual Roundhouse. I'm your host, Michael Trochet, and we'll see you in the next one. Enjoy the fights this weekend.